Hello again. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Piwas from the nutrition team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar on mapping child growth failure and the local burden of disease project at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle, Washington. This hour of the webinar is designed primarily for researchers and others interested in more technical information on the methods used to map child growth failure in the local burden of disease project. Professor Simon Hay, the director of the Geospatial Science at IHME, and Aaron Osgood Zimmerman, the lead author on the Nature paper, will lead this session. As in the last hour, we'll have time for questions at the end of the presentation, but you can send your questions to us at any time. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Simon Hay.
Hi, everyone. As Ellen's just said, my name is Simon Hay. I'm part of the Local Burden of Diseases group here at IHME. The team has been very kind to me and given me a chance to say a couple of things. I'm more of a cheerleader today than anything else, and Aaron will be taking the lion's share of walking you through our methods. I will be listening intently and looking at your questions as they come through, and hopefully be able to help with those at the end. So I am not going to take up too much time because Aaron is the one that you will be wanting to speak to or hear from, and I'm going to hand it over now. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon and Ellen, and for everyone who's tuned in today to listen to our webinar. Here's a quick outline of the talk that we'll be going through. Again, this one will be ordered similarly to the last talk if you were able to come in for that, but the emphasis will be on the actual modeling methods that we used to produce the results for this paper and the results that are now available for everyone to use. Here are the speakers, again, Simon and myself. And so first of all, I'd like to give you a slightly longer introduction to the Local Burden of Disease team at IHME and what we're doing here. So the Local Burden of Disease team was started by Simon almost 3 years ago with the intention of resolving national level estimates to a much higher resolution. The goal was to create a new tool for policymakers and researchers by making available widely covering high resolution disease and risk maps. The idea here is that national or even subnational estimates can hide important variation that are only available to view at a finer scale. Here we have an example of Nigeria, and you can see the national level estimates on average show up sort of orangish. This is, somewhere around 35 to 40% mean prevalence of stunting. But as you start zooming in to the next administrative level, so this is sort of state level, you can see that there's actually areas that are doing much worse in the north and areas that are doing much better in the south. And as we zoom in yet again to another level, to the administrative 2 level, sort of districts or county level, you can see that even within the administrative unit 1, there's much variation that can be hidden if you don't take that next step. And finally, we arrive at the 5 by 5 kilometer square resolution, which we produce all of our maps at. And again, the use of this data is to guide interventions that will benefit populations sort of most efficiently and hopefully increase equity. So we won't see national level estimates of improvement hiding subnational variation where communities might be left behind. So the main project goals for the Local Burden of Disease team are to assemble the world's largest data set on key diseases and risk factors, to create these high precision, high resolution maps of prevalence, incidence, and mortality for a wide ranging set of diseases and risks. Part of our primary goal is to create compelling and useful interactive data visualizations and tools so people can actually use the results. And not only do we need to produce these, but we also need to make sure that they're disseminated to policymakers, public health ministries, researchers, and donors to ensure that it's actually getting used to inform evidence-based decision-making. Our team today consists of over 50, I think close to 60 members. We have people from all walks of life and backgrounds helping us out. And the jobs on our team, they're also quite diverse. We have sort of what I think of the foundation of our team is a large number of data analysts, data extraction analysts, and data specialists who help us collect and collate, process, clean all the necessary data that we require to make these high resolution maps. On top of that, we have a nice team structure that ensures smooth research and communication. We have a suite of project officers who help lead projects and keep things moving. We have students working with us. We have faculty members and lead researchers. And we also have researchers and modelers who actually help run it. And on top of that, a little bit more recently, we have software engineers who help us take our code base and ensure that we have a smooth and reproducible pipeline to keep making our maps. The initial grant that helped launch the local burden of disease team was originally to map the 5 leading causes of under 5 mortality around the world. So these are malaria, diarrheal-related deaths, lower respiratory infections, which includes pneumonia, tuberculosis, and HIV and AIDS. Additionally, we also work to map under 5 mortality rates, educational attainment, child growth failure, which we'll be focusing on today, which to date we've published papers on stunting, wasting, and underweight, though we're also working to map low birth weight, child overweight, exclusive breastfeeding, among other things. We map a class of diseases that we loosely call neglected tropical diseases, wash and sanitation, Ebola, hemorrhagic fevers, pandemics, vaccine coverage for a suite of different vaccinations, and we're also interested in looking at antibacterial drug combinations. So I'm going to move on and start by talking a tiny bit about child growth failure and how we define that. And then I'll proceed to talking about the actual modeling. Finally, I'll get to a little bit of the results, implications, and mention some of the tools that we have available for you to further study this work. So for the sake of this project, we've studied 3 different aspects of child growth failure: stunting, wasting, and underweight. These are a specific subset of child undernutrition, excluding micronutrient deficiencies. The relationships between these 3 are defined by height and weight for given ages, and we define all of them using univariate growth standards, growth charts, produced by the WHO, where we compare individual children's heights, ages, and weights to a population, a reference population of healthy individuals. Stunting is defined to be low height for your age. So we take an individual's height and their age, we convert that into a z-score, so deviations from a mean using the WHO growth standards, and then we define an individual as stunted if they are less than 2 standard deviations away from the mean for that age group. Underweight is defined to be low weight for your age. So this is, again, we go through the same process. We look at a child's weight and we compare a similar age child and say what would be an average weight. We convert this z-score to a binary outcome for whether or not that specific individual is less than 2 standard deviations below the average weight for their age. And then finally, wasting is a combination of both the weight and the height metrics, where we look at how this child has grown by comparing their weight for their given height. So stunting is a more chronic long-term condition, which we believe relates to lots of risk factors for other diseases as they grow into adults. Wasting is more of an acute condition. And underweight, again, is low weight for your age. So of course, part of our goal here is not just to produce high resolution maps, pretty maps, but also to ensure that the analysis that we do is useful for policymakers. There are 2 primary child nutrition targets. One is the WHO global targets set for 2025 to improve young child nutrition. On the left-hand side of this slide, we see that For stunting, the goal is a 40% reduction in the number of children who are stunted relative to 2010 numbers. And for wasting, again, this is a relative target. And then the global nutrition target for wasting is by 2025 to ensure that childhood wasting is less than 5%. So that's an absolute target. Additionally, there are the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 2.2, which is to end all forms of malnutrition by 2030, which includes as part of the goal to achieve the global nutrition targets by 2025. With the background out of the way, I'd like to start talking about the actual modeling that we do and how we go from data collection through data processing, modeling, prediction, some validation, and all the way through to actually making the precision maps. So the rough overline of this process is that we extract data from as many sources as we can get our hands on and get entered into our database. We combine these with high resolution covariates. These covariates can be both satellite image derived or other modeled covariates, such as educational attainment. We feed the data and the covariates into an ensemble of machine learning and statistical models. And we use these to predict out best estimates of child undernutrition, malnutrition prevalences. And then we feed these into a model-based geostatistics model where we don't only use the covariates, but we also use information from nearby data points in both space and time to improve our predictions. After the main modeling stage, we ensure that our estimates at the national level are calibrated to the global burden of disease. This ensures that IHME is self-consistent, and additionally, we get to leverage information that the Global Burden of Disease Project can use, data sets that they can use, which we can't yet enter into the local burden of disease modeling. After calibration, we then get pixel level estimates with uncertainty intervals, and we use these to derive all sorts of other interesting, useful maps, such as rates of change over the last 15 years, projections of our estimates out to 2025, probabilities that locations and regions have already met their targets and whatnot. So first, I'll talk a little bit about how we actually collect our data and process it. The spatial data comes to us in two primary groups, two different categories. We have some data that we've been able to geo-reference to GPS coordinates. These are surveys where in the fields, the surveyors have collected GPS locations for the clusters that they're interviewing. And these represent an infinitesimal representation on a map. The models that we use are continuous in nature and sort of natively expect point data. Some of the surveys that we have, particularly as we go back in time, can't be matched to precise GPS coordinates. And instead, we only have summaries over aerial representations. So we call this polygon data. These might be measurements that are representative of districts or states. And when we can, we match the data that we have to the finest possible unit. So if possible, we try to match it to point data. If not, we try to match it to a aerial polygonal representation. And again, we match it to the finest polygon that we can accurately match it to. And then on the other hand, on the other side of things, we have raster covariate data. So these are our covariates used in our model to help inform our predictions. And the way this data enters our model is as discretized squares of continuous measurements over the whole region. So a little more detail on these. Again, the point data comes in as just points. Then we have our polygon data is represented as shape files. These are logically discrete. Each record refers to one item. These could be rivers, outlines, points, or aerial polygons, which is what we mostly use. And then the covariate data, again, comes in as rasters. Most commonly, these are sorted as geotiffs. You can think about these as digital images. Computers aren't continuous by nature. They're pixelated or discretized. And so in the same way, we have a discretized version of reality measured to 5 by 5 kilometer resolution. So in terms of actual data collection, this is the process that we use. First, we attempt to identify all relevant sources for data extraction. We primarily do this by using a Cooper project, which helps us query and search through the Global Health Data Exchange database. We use, for each project, a specific query with dedicated keywords. And then once we've done this, we cross-check our sources against those used by the Global Burden of Disease Project and other projects to ensure that we have sort of the most data that we can get. And then each of these data sources are reviewed for inclusion based on relevant variables available and sufficient geographic granularity. At the moment, we don't include national level data that can't be matched to finer resolution. Once we have a set of data sources that we would like to extract, they're code booked using an in-house tool called UCOV or Uber Covariates. Each individual level data source is standardized with variable names. So there might be a single, although different surveys might use different names for heights, weights, ages, and things like that. These are all standardized within one big extraction process. Once each data set has been code booked, we can extract all of them together and bind them into a single data set. At this point, every row in our data set represents a single individual. So this is a single child for our application today. And so as you go down our data set, each row represents a single child, and the columns represent the different covariates that we've extracted or the different parts of the survey that we've extracted. For us, primarily, we extract childhood or child's heights, weights, and ages, but we can also extract other information. At this point, we merge on the geographic information, GPS coordinates if they're available, or shapefiles for an administrative unit usually. We next perform some basic data cleaning checks. We ensure that all the variables have been extracted. We run a suite of tests to ensure that levels of missingness from any one survey aren't too high. And we also examine the distribution of each variable within a survey compared to the other surveys across space and time. This helps check for validity of the information and helps us pinpoint possible problems with some of the surveys. For instance, we've seen places that might have unusually high or low childhood levels of heights or weights. And then when we go back and we actually read the survey documentation, you might find information suggesting that the anthropometric data in this particular survey may not be trustworthy due to problems in the field for that particular survey collection. And this is relatively rare. For this project, among hundreds of data sources that we checked, we only ended up excluding 6 data sources due to either high missingness or very suspect measurements. Finally, the individual level data that we have is collapsed to cluster level, or in the case of GPS coordinates, or to polygon level. And then the last step that we take is to resample our polygon data to point. I'll talk about this more in a couple of slides, but again, the idea here is that the model that we use is continuous in nature, and we need continuous data to feed into it. So the main sources of data that we have are the demographic and health surveys, DHS, which is mostly funded by USAID, multiple indicator cluster surveys, or MICS, which is UNICEF-based surveys, the Living Standards Measurement Study, LSMS, which is run by the World Bank, and then the quick surveys, Core Welfare Indicators Questionnaire, which is often World Bank affiliated, but not necessarily. To supplement those, we also tried to get country-specific surveys, and we performed a comprehensive scientific literature review. So this is an example of what our data coverage looks like across space and time for stunting in particular. On the left-hand side of the plot, you can see a chart showing countries going down and time going across. And you can see the distribution of data that we have across the whole continent for the duration of our study. We include some data from the late 1990s, 97 and 98, to help us establish a baseline. And similarly, we also include some data from 2016 to help inform our 2015 estimates when we're drawing strength in space and time from nearby data points. You can see that we have plotted with points, circles, data sources that have given us GPS point data, and with triangles, data sources that have given us polygonal information. And then color-coded, we have the different types of sources. The size of the points is representative of the number of children, the sample size that has gone into each of those data sources. On the right, we see maps of these across space and time to give you some idea of both the spatial and geographic variation. As you saw on the last slide and on this side, we have areas which are quite data rich. For instance, in Eastern Africa, not only is it quite data rich, but we have tons of point data, relatively speaking. And with very good, robust data coverage, we can make confident predictions. Not only do we hope that they can be accurate, but our uncertainty reflects the amount of data at those locations. On the other hand, there are other areas which are much more sparse. So you can see parts of the southern part of the continent and the northern, where we have both little data and only polygonal data, which is, again, just less finely geo-referenced. And so in these places, our predictions reflect the fact that we have less data. This is a feature of our model. And while we can make mean predictions, if you look at the uncertainty, you'll see that they'll be much higher in locations where we have less data. So how do we actually generate these predictions, particularly in areas with sparse data? As I mentioned, we use covariates to help us inform our predictions across the whole space, but in particular, we leverage the relationships among the covariates to help us predict where the data is sparse. In addition to that, we also draw strength from nearby measurements in space and time to help us inform the data sparse locations. The types of covariates that we have are both satellite-derived and other modeled surfaces. So some of the satellite-derived covariates might be things like elevation, environmental index, irrigation, daytime temperatures, nighttime lights. And then we also use, again, some modeled covariates, such as child death rate from malaria, maternal educational attainment across Africa, and we use WorldPop's total population estimates, that we actually use the under 5 population estimates for the majority of this project. Okay, so I'm going to jump back now and tell you how we actually convert our polygon data to the point data for the sake of the model. And then after this, all the data processing will have been completed. So our current approach is to resample our polygon data to points spread amongst the polygon that they're representative of. And so in these figures below, you can see that in the first one, we have a single estimate that spans this administrative unit. It's a single value, it's purple, whatever number it may be. And what we do is we take the population raster for the under 5 child population, and we randomly, with population weighted draws, take samples at 10,000 locations. So we'll have more points drawn where the population is higher, fewer points drawn where it's low, but it is a random sample that's population weighted. And then at this point, we perform a k-means clustering algorithm to combine these 10,000 points into a subset of points that represents proxy population centers. The number of points that goes into each k-means cluster helps define the weight for that point. So you can see that high population area, there were more points resampled, and the k-means cluster is given a larger size there, which represents that in the actual model, it's given a larger weight. The sum of the weights across all the polygon resampled points for any one data point sum to 1. And again, points that are more representative of high population centers are given higher weights. At this point, we have a subset of data points that we've resampled, and each one of those is given the same value, this purple color, as the original polygon estimate. Under development, we have future ways to hopefully deal with this a little bit better, including actual integration over the polygons inside our model. And here's one citation for some current work being done on that at the University of Washington. Okay, so at this point, we have extracted, well, we've gone and we found a comprehensive set of data that exists. We've extracted it with a consistent code booking strategy. At the individual level, we've collapsed survey clusters, all the individuals within a single cluster, down to a single observation. And then for that cluster observation, we can calculate the prevalence or the percent of children in that cluster that are, for example, stunted. For the polygon data observations, we've resampled those to specific points, and each of those points are given a weight. And now we have a full set of point data that we can feed into our model. So here's the model structure. We use a Bayesian framework, which I don't have enough time to get into detail here, but I have a reference that you can see at the end where you can read more about that. But the idea is that we have a hierarchical model where at the top of it, we assume what the data generating mechanism is. We assume that for a cluster where Ni people have been sampled, there's a probability Pi that any one individual will have a particular risk. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to primarily use stunting as an example. I'll continue to do so now. So for Ni people, for cluster I, where we've surveyed N people, we assume that there's a prevalence of stunting Pi amongst that cluster, and then the number of stunted individuals follows a binomial random variable given both the Pi and the Ni. So both the prevalence at that location and the number of individuals that were measured. Our primary goal here is to map the prevalence of stunting across all of the space-time cube, so that's the whole continent for 2000 to 2016. To do this, we use a generalized linear additive model framework where we use a logit link function to relate the prevalence and the PIs to a linear combination of our covariates. Those are the XIs, so those are the covariates at a given location. The linear combination of those covariates with weights beta are added to an intercept alpha. And then on top of that, we have a space-time structured error process, Z, which we will use to further leverage information in space and time to improve our predictions. We assume that Z, conditional on some hyperparameters theta, follows a Gaussian process. I'll talk more about this in detail in the next few slides, with some covariance function C. And then on top of this, we have some unstructured error, the epsilon, which you can think about as, I guess, again, unstructured error, possibly measurement error, possibly cluster level effects, or just additional error and uncertainty in the model. And then we use this ensemble modeling framework, and due to the theory behind that, we ensure that the sum of our coefficients, the betas, adds up to 1. And then in the Bayesian framework, we add some hyperpriors, just prior distributions that are further down in the hierarchy to all the parameters that go into making up the errors, so both the space-time structured error and the unstructured error. So first I'll talk about, first I'll talk about the XI beta part there. So this is the covariate effect. So we use a stacking, also known as an ensemble modeling approach. The idea here is that different models that we might use have different strengths, and we would like to leverage all these in conjunction to improve our predictions. So instead of choosing just a single model with its own strengths, we'll fit multiple models and combine them all. So in this diagram on the right-hand side of the page, you can see that we combine our survey data. So this is all the data that we've converted to points in the extraction process, as well as our raster covariate data into 3 different models. So we used a generalized additive model. These in particular are good at looking at nonlinear relationships between the covariates and the outcome. We also fit a boosted regression tree model, the BRT. This machine learning model helps leverage interactions between the covariates, so we don't specifically have to specify what interactions might be useful features. With over 35 covariates going into our models, trying to identify all the best interactions and up to what order is an expensive computational task just due to the number of ways you could pick the interactions. So the BRT sorts that out for us. And then the last model that we use is a lasso or penalized linear model, regression model, where it also does some automatic variable selection for us. So once we fit these models, we predict out from these models across the whole space-time cube. So now we have 3 sets of predictions across the whole region that we're modeling over. And then we combine these predictions. Again, each one of these predictions has different strengths that we'd like to combine. So we combine these predictions in a final model-based geostatistics approach, where we use these predictions in conjunction with the space-time structured error, the Gaussian process model, to better improve our predictions and draw strength across all of the data measurements. Here's a reference for the stacking process in the bottom right. So now that we have sort of an overview of what we do, I'm gonna jump back a tiny bit and give more of an introduction, an example of model-based geostatistics, which I hope helps illuminate and elucidate what's going on in the Gaussian process in particular. So the geostatistical problem is generally interested in improved predictions. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that we have an underlying continuous spatial process Z. This is shown on the right, observed at some particular locations, n locations that we're going to index S1 through Sn. And that these measurements that we have seen, that we've observed, have different values. On the bottom of the screen, they're larger, representing larger values. On the top of the screen, they're smaller, representing smaller values. And the goal here is that we assume that distributed across space, places that are similar in space will have similar measurements. They don't necessarily have to be the same, but we're going to leverage this idea. A common geostatistical problem might be using temperature predictions at weather stations to help estimate the temperature between the weather stations. For us, we're going to use observations of stunting, wasting, or underweight prevalence at particular locations to help estimate the process where we don't have observations. And so the goal here is to estimate the process Z at an unobserved location, which we're going to call S0. So that represents the dot on the screen. And the intuition is that faced with a decision of how to predict here, we could say, generally, do we expect a large value or do we expect a small value? And by looking at nearby points, we might say we believe that it's more likely to see a small value given that the neighboring points all also have small values. And this is the whole idea behind geostatistical modeling. Then we can extend that a little bit further to actually estimate this process over the whole range of our data observation. So we started with some points at particular places. We asked the question, can we learn something given the points that we've observed at a new location? And furthermore, can we actually predict the whole underlying surface, where in this case, the bottom has sort of larger numbers shown by larger points, dark green, and the top of the process is generating smaller values. So what is a Gaussian process? This is an infinite dimensional multivariate normal distribution. Normal distributions, univariate normal distributions are bell curves. Gaussian distributions, they show up all the time, in part due to statistical theory, which says that as you aggregate, add up, or average lots of the same sort of random variable, the new random variable that's the average of all the other ones will tend to a normal distribution. So there's good reason to be working with these regularly. And the Gaussian process, this multivariate normal distribution, is completely defined by its mean, so its average tendency, and its covariance function, which defines the spread around the mean and the relationships possibly between different parts of the multivariate distribution. So marginally, a univariate, so a single point in this distribution, follows a Gaussian, a normal distribution, and any collection of these points follows a multivariate Gaussian distribution. In particular, the covariance function that we work with is a Matern covariance, and I have that written down on a future slide. But the main idea is that as distance between two locations increases, the correlation or the strength between the measurements decreases. And for this modeling project and the models that we currently fit on the local burden of disease team, all that matters is the distance between points, not the actual location in space or the direction of those distances. and then we can make a covariance matrix using this. So here's an example in 1 dimension. Our full example is in 3 dimensions, the 2 dimensions of space and the 3rd dimension of time that we model over. But to help illustrate this, we're going to work with a single 1-dimensional line. So we have 3 covariates in this example, shown as the top 3 maps on the left. And we're going to look at a slice across them in sort of central western, central eastern Africa. And across that slice, we could look at the pixel values of our covariates. So again, we work with these discretized raster objects. So in this example, we see as you index across space, we have different discrete values, and we have 3 covariates, x1, x2, and x3. And then for that same slice, we might also have some data observed across the region. There are places where we have higher values of interest and lower values of interest. And our goal is to make the best estimate of these measurements and also predict in between them. So here's the linear model part of our modeling framework again. So we have alpha, the intercept, and the xi's are our covariates, and the betas are the weights to help linearly combine them. And we might be able to fit a model that looks something like this, where we've taken a little bit of x1 and added it to a bit of x2 and added it to some of x3 in conjunction with the intercept, and we can produce predictions across the 1-dimensional slice of space that we're looking at. Of course, with these models, we may not be able to estimate the points exactly, and what we're left with is some residuals after we account for the effect of our covariates. So subtracting off our best estimates from the covariates, we're left with the residuals. And in this example, we can see that there's some structure to these. They're not randomly spread out around the line. At the left-hand side of the plot, we see 4 points which are above the line. They're all a little bit high, sharing a similar measurement. The next 4 are all a little bit low. Again, so neighboring points have some similarity. And again, this doesn't mean that all points will be directly correlated or even that closely correlated, but we're assuming that there's some structure as we look across space and eventually across time. To model this residual structure and to improve our predictions where we don't have any data, we again use this Gaussian process model, the Z. And so what we might fit is some smooth process, which by the nature of the smoothing covariance function is similar at similar points in space and attempts to also fit the data. And then lastly, we again have this unstructured error. So even after leveraging the structure in space, we still have some residual correlation. Combining those together, we can yield better estimates of the data locations. And so particularly, we use a Gaussian process, which is again 3-dimensional, 2 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. We use a separable model, and we build out this full space-time model using a Kronecker product, which is a form of matrix multiplication. The spatial covariance is a Matern model, where we fix the smoothness or the mean square differentiability, and we fit the correlation, so how fast the spatial correlation decreases over time, and also the overall amplitude of the process. You can see that it takes different shapes. And then we use an AR1 process, which is discrete in time and defines the correlation between adjacent time points. Putting that all together, we have this full space-time Gaussian process. To actually do this modeling, we need to convert from a continuous model to a discrete model. To do this, we use a finite elements mesh, where we lay down a mesh over the region that we're modeling, and we add up basis functions at the mesh points. And what we need to do then is we need to fit the height of the basis function at each of our mesh points and combine that to make a piecewise planar approximation. So on the right-hand side, you see a plot of the smooth surface. That's what we're actually trying to model. And the right-hand side, you can see the discretized approximation that we make using this finite elements mesh. Okay, so now we've gone through the whole model. We have this binomial distribution for the data collection. We have a generalized linear additive model, which describes the relationship between the covariates and the structured errors to the prevalence that we're trying to map. And then we additionally have some more distributions and hyperparameters to flesh out the rest of our Bayesian model. We fit this all with R-INLA. INLA stands for Integrated Nested Laplace Approximations, which is a method to approximate the Bayesian posterior distributions. This is an approximation to the fit. It's much faster than alternative methods such as Monte Carlo Markov chain simulations. And IHME itself is particularly flexible in the types of models that you can fit. It doesn't just have to be spatial, though that's primarily what we use it for. The idea behind the nested Laplace approximations is that for a number of conditional distributions, we match the mode of the distribution, which is shown on the right. We find the high point, and then we also match the curvature around the mode and use the simplified approximation to build up the approximate posterior solution. Okay, so once we have our model fit, we actually need to perform some prediction. To do this, we take 1,000 draws of our posterior model. So these are 1,000 draws across our best posterior distribution of the fit-in model surface. So on the left here, you see that we take draws of the actual parameters in our model. I've already discussed what these are. You have the intercept, the weights of the coefficients, the betas, the weights that go to the random effects, finite elements mesh modeling, and then the unstructured errors. We combine these using the formula that you've seen before to relate back to the prevalence at any one point. And we do this for all the pixels across space and time. So for pixel 1, we get across 16 years. For pixel 2, we have the 16 years of measurements. And then for each of these space-time pixels, we take 1,000 draws. On the left, you can see, again, an example of this in one dimension. We have some data points shown with their error bars. We fit a Gaussian process to it, and we could draw posterior draws. Each one of these draws represented by a gray line. Each one is a possible draw that could have realized the data. We take 1,000 of these draws, and then averaging them, we get a mean or median estimate across the space index, which is shown in red. Analogously, in space, you can see an animation of different draws from a spatial model. Each map is a possible candidate draw, a possible surface that could have been realized from our fit-in model. And then we can take the average across these draws or other summary metrics to learn and study how this process is behaving. So on the right, we have the mean across these animated draws. There are points that are close to our data, which are relatively uncertain. So as you take a slice across the gray lines, and then there are points that are further away from the data that are more uncertain. Again, this represents the relative uncertainty that we have and the increased uncertainty that we have in data sparse locations. The same thing applies in space. So from these 1,000 candidate maps, we can look at the distributions for any one pixel. If you'd like to read a little more about Bayesian geostatistics and health, there's a citation for you. And then we use these 1,000 draws to summarize all of our results. I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to speed through validation. But in short, we use 5-fold cross-validation. We chop up the space into contiguous chunks. Each chunk has an approximate same sample size. And then we break these chunks into 5 different folds. The model is fit 5 times. Once using 4 of the folds and holding out the 5th fold. Then we fit it again, holding out the 4th fold, using the other 5 folds, and so on. And then we fit it a 6th time using all the data simultaneously. This allows us to construct full sets of out-of-sample predictions, which helps us assess how we perform at locations where we have no data, since that data was withheld from the model. And then we also assess our in-sample prediction, which is used to generate our final maps. We perform some summary metrics, such as the mean error, the root mean squared error. So our mean error is bias, root mean squared error talks about the spread around our estimates. We look at the correlation between our estimates and the observed data, and also our 95% coverage, which helps us assess how well our spread is actually matching the true data. We do this both in sample and out sample, and on the right-hand side, you can see how well our estimates, which are shown on the y-axis with uncertainty, match the actual data, which is shown on the x-axis. And in general, we match it quite closely. Where we can, we also show how well our estimates compare to other similar estimates. So we do this both for the global burden of disease, and we see that in general, we can compare our nationally aggregated estimates to the GBD estimates and see that we have quite high correlation, 0.983 with an interquartile range of 0.92 to 1.05. And then we can also compare our estimates to the representative DHS estimates from the survey data. And we see even though that we're using different data sets than just DHS, we actually align quite closely with the direct survey level estimates. Quickly, our limitations include that our model is only as good as the input data. And in locations that are sparse and with more polygonal data than point data, we are more uncertain. Our models in general are optimized for prediction, not necessarily inference. Again, the goal here is to create a policy tool which provides precision maps for decision makers. And one of the costs of doing this is that we can't perform inference because we actually use our data twice, the first time in the stacking ensemble and the second time in the Gaussian process modeling. And then lastly, although we try our best to propagate uncertainty using the 1,000 draws, at the moment we aren't capable, due to computational limitations, to propagate uncertainty from our modeled covariates all the way through. As we're approaching the end of our time, I'm going to talk about results, implications, impact, and the tools that we have available to use this. But I'd like to remind you that you have a forum to ask us questions, and in some of the remaining minutes, we will try to get to those. So please enter them into the chat box if you have any. So briefly, some of our results. Again, these were gone over in more detail in the last webinar, which will be available recorded at a later time. And so what we have is on the right, these are the 5 by 5 kilometer estimates that we produce. These are estimates for stunting in 2015. And given these are the native outputs of our mapping process, and we can aggregate these up to other useful administrative levels for policy work. So we have, going from right to left, these estimates aggregated up to admin 2 level, admin 1 level, and the national level, which are calibrated again to the global burden of disease estimates. I'm going to just flip through in time so you can see better how we can actually assess performance improvements of and decreased stunting prevalence over time. So here are the estimates from 2000, 2005, 2010, and 2015. You can actually see that there's been fantastic improvement across the continent as a whole, and this is one of the most exciting aspects of the results that we've been able to demonstrate. Of course, there's some sub-national variation, and again, we use the 1,000 draws that we have to produce all sorts of summary estimates. So from the 1,000 draws, we can look at the 2.5 and 97.5% quantile to get 95% uncertainty intervals. And if you go back either in the paper or in some of our visualization tools, you'll see that areas with higher levels of uncertainty are usually overlapping with areas where we have sparser data. So we hope that this will be an interesting and useful tool for developing future data collection in the field as well. We can use our 1,000 draws to summarize things in lots of different ways. This is one of my personal favorite maps where we've used the draws across space and time. So look at areas that had the lowest, so the best outcomes for stunting in 2000, shown in light green, the places that were lowest in 2015 in medium green, and then places that were both lowest in 2000 and 2015 were actually quite rare, though you see some in North Africa. Similarly, we can also show places that have the highest prevalence, so the highest burden of stunting in 2000, the highest in 2015, and places that have maintained the highest burden of stunting in both 2000 and 2015. And overlaid with this, we have places that had the largest rates of change, the most improvement, and places with the smallest rates of change. And you can start to tease apart narratives about different locations where you have places that were performing poorly in 2015 with high burdens, but they have worked very hard to improve themselves and have transformed out of the lowest 10% into better performance. I'm going to skip through these since they've been gone over before and you can see them in the paper, but we have maps of the annualized decrease in stunting, and we have them mapped relative to on-track progress to meet the global nutrition targets. You can see places that have already met the G&Ts, places that are on track, exceeding the pace needed, or possibly need to speed up in order to get there. You can see that there's actually quite wide swaths of Africa that need to increase their rate of change in order to meet these targets. We can use our models to project forward to the future. We don't have covariates from 2015 to 2025 since they haven't been measured yet, since they haven't been lived through yet. But what we do is we look at the rate of change between 2000 and 2015 and use that to forecast forwards. This is a map that shows the acceleration required to meet the targets. Using the draws, since we have them for 2015, 1,000 draws of possible candidate services, we can also assess the probability of having met the targets. Again, these are in the paper and online. We have the exact same sets of outcomes for wasting and for underweight. I talked primarily about stunting today, but the full suite of resources is available for all of these outcomes. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the implications that we have that came out of this work. So for us, publishing in high impact publications is important because of the peer review process to be vetted by both peers in statistics and peers in child growth failure research. The study was published in Nature Open Access, which we negotiated with Nature to ensure that it was available to everyone. We were privileged to have Kofi Annan write a commentary on the work to highlight the importance and use of data to combat malnutrition, both in Africa and around the world. And we hope that the study will highlight regions that may be experiencing higher burden or getting left behind as most of the continent marches towards the targets. We hope that the tools will be immensely useful for precision public health to help people target regions for interventions and to help policymakers, governments, and organizations assess the current rate of progress and assess the pace towards goals. Lastly, for us, getting our publication into the media is important to ensure that people see it, and with higher visibility, we hope that there will be higher adoption. Lastly, some ideas on how decision makers can use our research is, again, by targeting interventions, by studying areas with higher uncertainty that might need future survey collection, and by assessing the rates of progress towards our goals. Okay, very quickly, tools to explore further. I'm gonna just point out that these exist, show you what they look like, and then take questions. Yes. If anybody has questions, please type them in. At the moment, we don't have any, but we're happy to wait for a couple minutes. While you're typing them in, I'll just show you a slide of what our visualization tool looks like. You can see the website that where you can visit it at the bottom, vishub.healthdata.org/lbd/CGF. The tool is interactive. You can query for specific countries or regions that you would like to go to. It'll take you there. You can also just scroll around the map, studying different results. We have mean estimates of stunting, wasting, and underweight, as well as measurements of uncertainty. If you click on locations, you can see the trends across time with the actual estimates. And you can see these results both for the fine geospatial resolution as well as the aggregated level at admin 1 and admin 2 and admin 0 national levels. Furthermore, all of our estimates are available on the Global Health Data Exchange. You can go there to actually download the raster objects that we use for these mean maps in case you'd like to perform your own research or study them in more detail than the Viz tool allows. And all the code that we use to make these products is also available on a public-facing Git repository. The link to that can be found on the Global Health Data Exchange.
So we just had one question come in that asks, do you have plans to perform these analyses in other regions?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess 2 points there. One, although we have done a pretty comprehensive job with this initial mapping, this is a work in progress. We would greatly appreciate feedback from individuals who think that the estimates might be improved in particular locations, and especially if you have access to data in those locations, we'd be particularly interested in talking with you, but again, it's a work in progress. Secondly, we are aiming to expand this research to what we call global mapping. The next stage of the mapping project will extend this to something like 120 countries around the world. which will cover about 97% of the burden of child growth failure around the world. Eventually, this may be used in conjunction with the global burden of disease estimates in high-income countries where child growth failures has a relatively low burden to produce global maps. But yes, we do hope to iterate and improve upon the maps in Africa while extending to a larger geographic region. I'm going to spend a minute showing you a little bit about a little more of the visualization while we wait for more questions in case anyone is working on entering them in. So here is the Viz tool. Again, you can just go to the website, and when you land on it, you'll be presented with an overall picture of the continent. You can see right now in the options box, you have a bunch of different ways that you can interface with the tool. Right now, we're looking at prevalence, but you can also look at the relative annualized rate of decline. You can pick through the different risks, stunting, wasting, and underweight. And you can also look at these models across time. When you land, you start with our most recent estimates, 2015, but you can flip back to 2000, and you can actually play forwards and see the progress over time. It takes a little while to refresh each time, but it will play through for you, and you can get an idea of the progress that has been experienced by the vast majority of the continent. Besides that, you can look at different statistics. Again, I mentioned a couple times that we produce uncertainty estimates for all of these. We're showing the mean right now, but if you're interested in studying the range of our possible uncertainty in the estimates, you can take a look at the upper uncertainty interval or the lower one. Again, you can zoom in to different locations if you are interested in particular. There's a search bar as well. And then once you zoom in, it'll reload for you at the pixel level. The detail bar on the bottom shows different administrative layers beneath the estimates. So here we're showing the administrative unit 1 outlines. So again, this is state and then, or region, and then you can zoom in, not zoom in, excuse me, you can overlay the administrative unit 2s, which are sort of county level estimates. Similarly, you can look at the estimates aggregated up to different administrative units by switching the data display to aggregate. If you click on any one of these, you can look at our estimates over time with the uncertainty estimates. And with that, I will thank you for listening in today and hope that you explore our tools and the data, and the slides will be shared as well as a video of the webinar. Thank you very much. Yeah, we had one last question come in about the availability of the data at different geographic resolutions for downloading, and the data is available at the pixel level with raster objects across all of Africa for 2000 to 2015. But in addition to that, we also have aggregated estimates available in a CSV spreadsheet of the estimates aggregated to the admin 1s, state level, and the admin 2s for all the countries that we map across all of time with the uncertainty level estimates as well. You can reach all of this at the GHDX, the Global Health Data Exchange, and the link to it is right here, ghdx.healthdata.org/record/Africa Child Growth Failure Geospatial Estimates 2000-2015. So yes, they're available. The national level estimates are exactly aligned with the global burden of disease estimates. So you can find those through in the GBD compare tools, which can be reached through the healthdata.org website.